I want you to think of your favorite comic book. Maybe it's this one, or this one, maybe even this one. Whatever it is, I want you to think about your favorite part of that comic, why you love it. Maybe you adore the hilarious comedy shown in every issue. Maybe you appreciate how fun the action is. Maybe you really like the deep characters or the fascinating storylines. Whatever it is that makes you love comic books so much, I want you to imagine if all of that was continuous throughout the run of the comic. Because with most comic book series, they have their ups and downs, right? You'll start a comic and it'll be great, and then eventually it'll sort of get to a low point where it's not that great anymore, and then it'll sort of pick back up and it's at its best, and then it'll fall down again. The point is, no comic is perfect. But what if your favorite thing about those comic books was not only there for all of it, but was also always good? And I'm not just talking about those three things I mentioned, I'm talking about pretty much everything. What is this comic? Why am I praising it and saying that it's continually awesome and has something for everybody? I'm talking about Atomic Robo, one of the most underrated comic books I've ever heard of. So, what is Atomic Robo? Why am I praising it? Well, it's a sci-fi comic, sort of. It's a comedy action sci-fi comic. It's funny, but it's got sci-fi and it's got a lot of fighting and action. It's just really awesome. The comic follows the adventures of Atomic Robo, a robot built by Nikola Tesla in the 1920s. We follow him throughout his adventures from the 20s all the way up to the present day and even beyond. After Nikola Tesla died, he created his own company called Tesladyne, which founded the job of action scientist. Essentially, action scientists are scientists that also go out and kill all the weird sciencey monsters that the government can't handle. The concept is fairly simple. It's about a robot built by a famous scientist who then becomes a famous scientist and fights weird sci-fi monsters. It's a very awesome concept, and I love it a lot. But why would I praise it this much? What is so good about this comic that I would say it's nearly perfect? Well, let me explain for you. The storylines are fascinating, but they're not very in-depth, and you don't need to start from the beginning. See, Atomic Robo is an anthology comic, meaning it doesn't have any particular order. There will be certain story arcs that take place over a couple of issues, sure, but it's not one continuous story. One issue will have you in the 90s fighting talking dinosaurs, and I'm not kidding about that, by the way, it's awesome. And then the next issue will have you in World War II fighting robot Nazis. The stories are spread out and very meticulous as well. You can start anywhere, and you'll feel like you know what's going on as long as you know who Robo is. But if you read through the series, you'll start to pick up things over time that become important later. Not in the sort of, oh crap, if I didn't read the comic I have no idea what's going on sort of way, but more in the, oh hey, I recognize those guys, that's really cool that they're bringing them back. The storylines in that way are very fascinating because it allows you to jump in anywhere, but at the same time, it encourages you to go back and read through the entire series. And each story in and of itself is very fascinating. Some of them are very short one-shot stories, and then some of them are more 4 or 5 issue stories that take up a full graphic novel. And this type of storytelling is very interesting and exciting because it allows for a lot of freedom with what you read. You can skip over certain issues or storylines you don't like, and then go straight into what you do. I'm just kidding. What storylines would you not like? Next, there's the characters. These characters are really interesting. At first, a lot of them seem fairly one-dimensional, but over time, especially with Robo, you start to really get to know them, and you start to see a lot of the more three-dimensional things about them. One of the best examples of this is a character named Jenkins. Jenkins is, without a doubt, the toughest character in the entire series. And at first, you're going to see him as sort of the growly, super tough, no-nonsense guy. And yeah, he is that. But he's also someone that really cares deeply about his job, and more importantly, his friends, specifically Robo. He's willing to fight and even die for what he believes in. There are also a lot of other characters that get the same sort of treatment that are very fascinating. Some of them start being interesting from the very beginning, and others take a little while to get to know. For example, there's the Sparrow, a female British secret agent who goes around and tries to fight Nazis during World War II, and oh my god, it was Agent Carter before Agent Carter existed. From the beginning, you can tell that she's very fun and interesting and fresh. And then there are other characters, for example, Bernard, who start out sort of very one-note. Hey, he's just there, he's a scientist, he's smart, he's sort of afraid of stuff, but at this point he's gotten used to it. But then as you see his origins and you see some of the more interesting things about him and you see him change and grow as a character, you start to realize, yeah, he's more interesting than that. He's sort of lovable and fun and kind of weird, but at the same time, you can get used to the weirdness. There are all kinds of characters like that all over the series where you start to think they're awesome. Some from the very beginning and others take a little getting used to. The best example of this is Robo, but I'm saving that for the ending statement because it's very important that I talk about that. Next, there are the villains. Now, why are villains such a big deal in a comic book like this? Well, some of them aren't really. Some of them are fairly forgettable and only show up for one storyline or so. But then there are others like Dr. Dinosaur. Remember how I said that there was a talking dinosaur in the 90s? Essentially, Dr. Dinosaur is a time-traveling raptor, except no one believes he's a raptor or a time traveler. They believe he's just some sort of genetic experiment. And for the most part, it's actually sort of left ambiguous as to what he really is, which I think is kind of fun. Really, he's the best villain. He's so good. He's funny, he's weird, he's interesting. I've always sort of imagined him to be played by Tom Kenny, and he's really cool. Actually, speaking of which, hey, guys, Adult Swim, you ever thought about making an Atomic Robo cartoon? I know some people that would very much like to see that. Me. Please, guys. There's another villain named Helsingard, who's a Nazi scientist who is killed in the first issue, and then comes back as a robot with his brain plugged into it. It's amazing, and he seems intimidating, which is one of the very few villains that actually feels this way. A lot of them seem sort of like jokes, or they're just brainless monsters. But Helsingard can actually be a very serious threat a lot of the time, which is cool that you have that balance. You've got some funny villains, but then you've got Helsingard, who's really, really tough and really impossible to beat. The villains in this series are usually as good as the heroes. There's so much depth to them, they're so unique that you sort of get a sense that these are awesome, and the people that made these characters are awesome. The comedy in Atomic Robo is amazing. If I'm feeling down, or even if I just want to laugh, I'll go to Atomic Robo because I know I can laugh there. Atomic Robo is one of those comics that is continually funny no matter how many times you read the joke. Yeah, some of them, after a little while, you sort of expect the punchline, but they're still funny. A lot of these jokes are very well written, and you get a sense that the people making these jokes know not only how to do comedy, but they also think the jokes are funny themselves, which adds to the humor of it. These jokes are a huge part of the comic. They make it feel funny and interesting, and so much more than just an action sci-fi comic. It's really a big part of it, and without it, I'm not sure it'd be the same series. The action in this series is phenomenal. You'd assume, oh yeah, it's the same thing over and over again. Robo fights a monster, Robo blows up the monster, Robo wins. But it's so much more subtle than that a lot of the time. Not to say it's very subtle that he's hitting monsters with cars, but there's also more intricate fights. Ones where he can't win with his fists, and he has to win with brains. A lot of these fights seem so different from each other because he's fighting so many different villains. He's fighting so many different creatures and monsters, and it gets exciting to see all the variation they can produce. Not every fight is perfect or different from each other, but a lot of them are. The action is fun, and they do a really good job of applying all the comedy and jokes and nuance of the rest of the series into these fight scenes as well. Each character has their own unique fighting styles, some of them are more indestructible than others, and it's all laced with humor. These fights are really well written and drawn. As I said before, one of the best parts about the series is that it jumps around in time. It doesn't go straight forward from the 20s all the way to the present. It jumps around. One issue you'll be in the 90s, one issue you'll be in the 40s, then the 50s, then the 20s, and so on and so on. It's really cool because you get to jump around through time and these different cultures and see how everything's so different and how it changes as the decades go by. It's one of those things where you don't really think about it as you live through it. You think, oh yeah, the 90s or the early 2000s, that's just a little while ago. Not that much has changed. But then you look back and you see it in an anthology series where you don't know how far it is, and you get to see back to back how the 2000s are different from the 80s. And it's such a drastic change, and it's so interesting to get to see that. It also allows for a lot of useful things where, hey, you know, Atomic Robo already killed that monster. How is it here? Well, it's because it took place before that comic. It's really cool to see stuff like that, and it's really exciting to have that opportunity to go through and look at history through the eyes of Robo, especially since Robo is really the only constant in the series. And that's where I wanted to end this video, talking about Robo. See, when you read the comic for the first or second times, you'll start to think, oh yeah, Robo's pretty one note. He stays the same throughout the series. But then you look through the comic again, and you realize just how much Robo's changed. See, when you look at the 20s compared to the present day, you see just how different he is. In the 20s, he was willing to make relationships, have close friends, even girlfriends. He was able to fall in love and feel things for other people. You compare that to the 2000s, and you get the sense that he doesn't really feel close to anybody. That's what the writers of this comic did so well. They very subtly, very casually showed you just who Robo is. Robo is alone. There's nothing to it more than that. Robo is a robot. He can't die. The closest he's come is running out of power for a century. And even then, all they had to do was hook him up to a car battery and he's alive again. And that weighs on Robo a lot more than you'd think. He sees everyone around him die, whether it's of old age or due to the dangerous nature of their work through science that kills them. He no longer feels safe making friends because he knows that one day they'll just go with everyone else. He isn't close to Jenkins or Bernard or anyone because he doesn't feel like it's worth it. He knows he'll just lose them again. That's not to say he's mean, that's not to say he's cruel, or that he feels nothing. But he doesn't feel the same closeness to them that he did back when he was a kid. And that is the genius of Atomic Robo. Through all the jokes, through all the villains, through all the action, the exciting stories, and the history, if you compare Robo in the 20s to now, you see that he's not the same person. Robo, just like every human being that's ever lived, changes over time. And not only does he change, he realizes that he's immortal, more than anyone else is. The only person who's ever come close to surviving for as long as Robo has was Helsingard. And that's the one guy that hates Robo the most. That does not feel good for Robo. It's so subtly written that you don't even notice it at first. There's one time where they ever bring up just how lonely Robo is, and it's in one of the first issues. After that, they don't really cover it that much. You have to notice that stuff for yourself, and that's what they did so well. Robo is alone. And that means that if Robo feels and he's alone, Robo is human. Robo represents us, our fear of being alone, of watching everyone around us die. He makes jokes and he jumps into dangerous situations because he doesn't care anymore. Because he's trying to hide the loneliness. He is what the human race would be if we didn't die. Robo is so subtly written, more so than I even expected, more so than I think even the writers expected at times. Robo is amazing. He's the most human character in the entire comic. Atomic Robo is my favorite comic book of all time. Not only is it funny, with amazing action, amazing villains, the best characters I've ever seen, it's also continually so. It never gets bad, at least not so far. Atomic Robo is everything I want in a comic. It's everything I could hope for. Oh, and in case you're saying, wow, this comic seems great, but I don't really have money for comics right now, the entire thing is free. It's a web series now. It originally started out as an indie comic produced by Red 5, but now it's all online, baby. I will leave a link in the description to the entire comic on their website. And maybe if you have some extra cash, you can go support them on Patreon. I will leave a link to their Patreon in the description as well, because please, I do not want this comic to end. Atomic Robo is one of those comics that does not get the appreciation it deserves. It's so well written and well crafted. It's made by two people that love what they do and love what this comic's about. They love the history and the comic and the characters. They love the science and everything in this series, and they want to share that love with the world. This comic is amazing. Atomic Robo is one of the only perfect comic books. Thank you for watching this video. This is Ultra Nerd, signing off.